My name is Maya, and I'm 58 years old. I never thought I'd cancel my own mother-in-law's credit card while standing alone in my kitchen, my hands shaking. But that day, one phone call changed how I heard every truth after it. What I discovered tied my husband, his secret, and my Emile together in a way I never saw coming. Tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe for more real family drama and emotional courage stories. The phone rang while I was rinsing a coffee mug that had already gone cold. It was just past 9 in the morning, the quiet hour when the house settles after the rush. I almost didn't answer. Unknown number. I usually let those go, but something made me dry my hands on a dish towel and pick up. "Hello, this is Maya," I said, my voice steady, practiced from years of answering calls I didn't want. "Good morning, ma'am. This is Karen calling from your credit card company. Do you have a moment to verify some recent activity?" Her tone was polite, careful, not rushed. That alone made my shoulders stiffen. "Yes," I said. "I have a moment." I leaned against the counter, staring at the little crack in the tile I'd been meaning to fix for months. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a delivery truck passed. Everything felt normal. Too normal. Karen asked me to confirm my name, address, and the last 4 digits of my social security number. I answered without thinking. I'd done this before. Fraud alerts happen. People lose cards. Machines make mistakes. "Thank you," she said. "Now, I just need to ask about a few charges from the past 2 weeks." I waited for the usual grocery store or gas station mix-up. Instead, she said the name of a women's clothing store I hadn't stepped into in years. My brow furrowed. "I don't shop there anymore," I said slowly. She paused. "Okay, how about a second charge from a boutique in Westbrook Mall?" My heart gave a small, uneven beat. Westbrook was across town. I hadn't been near it. "No," I said, "that's not mine." She kept going. Shoes, accessories, a cafe, receipt, all mid-afternoon, all on weekdays. I was at work during those times. I told her, my voice thinner now. "I understand," Karen replied gently. "That's why we're calling." She asked me to hold for a moment. The line filled with soft music. I stared at my reflection in the microwave door. Same face, same lines around my eyes, but something behind them had shifted. When she returned, she asked, "Can you confirm who is listed as an authorized user on this account?" The question landed heavier than the others. "There's just one," I said automatically. Then I stopped. "Well, 2. Can you tell me their name?" "My mother-in-law," I said. "Linda." I added her 3 years earlier. She'd been struggling after my father-in-law passed. Small pension, tight budget. I wanted to help without making her ask every time. Groceries, prescriptions, gas. That was the agreement. Karen acknowledged the name. Then she said, "Just to clarify, the purchases were made in person using the physical card." I swallowed. Yes, she has the card. Was she alone during these purchases? Karen asked. I don't know," I said honestly. There was another pause. Then Karen said something that made my stomach drop. One of the merchants mentioned a second individual during verification. A younger woman. The air felt thinner. "What do you mean?" They noted 2 shoppers present. One older, one younger. They didn't flag it at the time, but it came up when we reviewed receipts. I gripped the edge of the counter. My mind raced through explanations that didn't fit. A neighbor, a cousin, a store clerk misunderstanding. Karen's voice stayed calm. "Do you recognize any of the following names associated with loyalty accounts used at these stores?" She read a name I didn't know. Then she read another. The second one hit like a quiet crash. I'd heard it once before. Just once. Months ago. In passing, my husband had mentioned a coworker who brought cupcakes to the office. I hadn't thought about it again. Until now. I'm not sure, I said. That's okay, Karen replied. You're not required to make any decisions right now. I just wanted to alert you. She asked if I wanted to freeze the card temporarily. I told her I needed time. After we hung up, I didn't move. I stood there with the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to nothing. The house felt different, like it was holding its breath. I walked to the living room and sat down slowly. My knees felt weak. I looked around at the photos on the wall. Holidays, birthdays, Linda smiling beside us. My husband's arm always around her shoulders, mine around his waist. I told myself I was overthinking, that this was just confusion, but something about the timing bothered me. The days, the hours, mid-afternoon, when my husband said he was running errands or helping his mom. I checked my calendar, Tuesdays and Thursdays. Those were his short days at work. My chest tightened. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I'd lived long enough to know that fear fills gaps too easily. So I decided to do something simple, something grounded. I called Linda. She answered on the third ring. Hi, sweetheart. Her voice sounded cheerful. Normal. Hey, I said. Quick question. Have you been using the card more than usual lately? Oh, she laughed lightly. Just a little shopping. You know how it is. With anyone else? I asked, trying to sound casual. There was a brief pause, just long enough to notice. Sometimes your husband stops by, she said. He insists. My stomach flipped. And anyone else? No, she said quickly. Too quickly. Why? No reason, I replied. Just checking. We said goodbye. I stared at the phone again. That pause replayed in my head, over and over. I decided to step outside. The sun felt too bright. I sat on the porch steps and listened to birds I couldn't name. My hands were cold despite the warmth. I thought about trust, how quietly it breaks, not with shouting or slammed doors, but with little moments that don't line up. Later that afternoon, I drove to the grocery store. I needed milk, something normal to anchor me. As I waited in line, I noticed a display of scarves near the register. The same brand Karen had mentioned earlier. My chest tightened again. The cashier smiled. Cute, right? They've been selling fast. I nodded. Who's buying them? She shrugged. All kinds. Older women. Younger ones, too. Had a pair in here last week. Mom and daughter. Maybe. I forced a smile. Maybe. I walked out without the milk. By the time I got home, my head hurt. Questions pressed in from all sides, but no answers felt solid enough to grab. That evening, my husband came home later than usual. He kissed my cheek, asked about my day. Quiet, I said. He nodded, distracted, checked his phone, went to shower. I sat alone at the kitchen table, the same spot where the call had started. The light above me buzzed faintly. I realized something then. The call hadn't just told me about charges. It had changed how I listened. Every pause, every word, every excuse. I hadn't discovered everything yet, but I'd heard enough to know that silence had been expensive, and I was the one paying for it. I didn't sleep much that night. The phone call echoed in my thoughts, steady and clear. It wasn't the truth, but it was the door to it. I lay awake long after the house went quiet, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun in slow, uneven circles. The sound had always comforted me. That night, it felt like a ticking clock. Every turn seemed to bring back a moment I had pushed aside. Not loud moments, not dramatic ones, just small things I'd brushed off because life was busy, because marriage is long, because doubt feels rude when you've shared decades with someone. The next morning, I moved through the house carefully, as if any sudden motion might knock loose something I wasn't ready to face. My husband was already gone when I woke up. That wasn't unusual. He liked to beat traffic. Still, his side of the bed was cold in a way that made me pause. I stood there longer than necessary, my hand resting on the empty pillow, listening to the quiet. In the kitchen, his coffee mug sat in the sink, barely used. He'd taken one sip, maybe two. He used to finish every cup. I told myself it meant nothing. People change habits. That's what I'd always said. I poured my own coffee and sat at the table, watching the sunlight crawl across the floor. As I sipped, my mind drifted back over the past few months, landing on moments I'd labeled as forgettable. At the time, they felt too small to matter. Now, they lined up differently. There was the afternoon. He came home smelling faintly of a floral soap I didn't buy. I'd asked about it, half joking. He smiled and said the restroom at work must have changed brands. I laughed with him. Offices do that. It wasn't worth a second thought. There was the night Linda called late, asking him to come over because her TV remote wasn't working. He offered to go alone, said it would be faster. I remember feeling a pinch of disappointment. I liked going with him, but I stayed home and folded laundry instead, telling myself I was being practical. I finished my coffee and rinsed the mug, my hands moving automatically. The day stretched ahead, heavy and slow. I had errands to run, but no energy to start them. Instead, I sat back down and opened my notebook, the one I used for grocery lists and reminders. I didn't know why I picked it up. I just needed to write something. I flipped through old pages, doctor appointments, birthdays, notes like Linda, pharmacy, written in my handwriting. I remembered how often I'd offered to pick things up for her, how often she'd said my husband was already handling it. He insists, she'd say, smiling. He worries. At the time, it sounded sweet. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed. A text from Linda. Hope you're having a good day. Thank you again for always helping me. I stared at the message longer than I should have. The words felt heavier than they used to. Not kind. Careful. I typed back a simple heart emoji and set the phone face down. I decided to get dressed and leave the house. Staying inside was making my thoughts louder. I drove to the pharmacy first, the same one Linda used. As I stood in line, I noticed a display of greeting cards. One caught my eye. Thinking of you. Simple. Plain. I wondered who had been thinking of whom lately. When it was my turn, the pharmacist greeted me by name. I'd been coming there for years. Picking up for Linda today, she asked casually. The question landed harder than expected. No, I said, just for me. She nodded. She was in earlier this week. With your husband. My throat tightened. Oh, nice woman, she added. She seemed happy. Happy. The word echoed as I walked back to my car. I sat there with the engine off, hands on the steering wheel, replaying the tone. There was nothing suspicious in her voice, just an observation. That's what made it worse. These weren't secrets whispered in corners. They were moments happening in plain sight. On the drive home, I remembered a dinner from last month. Linda had complimented my earrings, said they looked new. They weren't. I'd worn them for years, but she'd stared a little too long, her eyes narrowing in thought, as if comparing them to something else. I'd shrugged it off, telling myself she was getting older. Memory slips happen. That afternoon, I folded laundry and found a receipt in my husband's jeans pocket. Gas station. Different side of town. I held it between my fingers, debating whether to ask. I didn't. He'd probably just taken a different route. I tossed it in the trash and kept folding. Later, as I vacuumed the living room, I noticed the smell again. That soft, floral note, lingering faintly on the couch cushion where he liked to sit. I paused, the vacuum still running, and felt a wave of irritation rise. Not anger, something duller, like being dismissed without words. When he came home that evening, he was cheerful, too cheerful. He talked about a new project at work, laughed at his own stories. I nodded and smiled, adding the right sounds at the right times. Marriage teaches you how to perform normal even when something feels off. At dinner, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it and turned it face down. I noticed how quickly he did it. Smooth. Practiced. Everything okay? I asked. Yeah, he said. Just spam. I believed him. Or maybe I chose to. After he went to bed, I stayed up watching television I didn't care about. My mind wandered again, this time to Linda's comments over the past year. How she'd begun to mention other women in strange ways. Some women don't appreciate what they have, she'd said once, stirring her coffee. I thought she meant a neighbor. I nodded politely. Another time, she'd sighed and said, men need to feel useful. I'd agreed, thinking she was talking about herself and her late husband. Now, those words rearranged themselves in my mind, forming shapes I didn't like. The next few days passed with the same quiet tension. Nothing obvious happened. That was the hardest part. Betrayal doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind routines. I met a friend for lunch on Thursday. We talked about our grandchildren, about rising grocery prices, about the weather. Normal things. I didn't mention my worries. Saying them out loud felt like making them real. As we stood to leave, she asked, "How's Linda doing?" "She's fine," I said automatically. "Good," my friend replied. "I saw her at the mall last week. She looked lively." The words stuck with me all the way home. That evening, Linda called. She asked if I could help her order something online later in the week. I said yes, of course. That's what I always said. "Your husband showed me a few things already," she added. "He has such good taste." I felt a flicker of something sharp. "Oh, yes," she said warmly. "He's very thoughtful." After we hung up, I sat on the couch and stared at the wall. Thoughtful. That was the word she'd used when she talked about him, lately. Always thoughtful. Always attentive. I began to realize how often she'd praised him in front of me. How rarely she'd mention me at all. That night, I went through old photos on my phone. Family gatherings. Birthdays. Holidays. In recent pictures, Linda and my husband stood closer together. Not touching. Just aligned. Smiling at the same angle. I'd been there too, always just a step to the side. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was tired. That one phone call had made me suspicious of everything. But suspicion doesn't grow without soil. And mine had been fertile for a while. On Saturday morning, I drove past the Westbrook Mall, without meaning to. Traffic rerouted me that way. As I waited at a light, I glanced at the storefronts. The boutique Karen had mentioned stood out, bright and inviting. I watched women go in and out, laughing, carrying bags. I imagined Linda there, imagined my husband beside her, imagined a third presence I couldn't quite see. The light turned green. I drove on. That afternoon, I cleaned out the hall closet. It was a task I'd been putting off. Old coats, shoes we didn't wear. At the back, I found a shopping bag. New, from that same boutique. My breath caught. I picked it up slowly. Inside was tissue paper. No receipt. No item. I stood there, holding emptiness in my hands, and felt something settle inside me. Not panic, recognition. When my husband came home, I didn't mention it. I couldn't yet. I needed to understand how many signs I'd ignored before I spoke. That night, as we lay in bed, he reached for my hand. I let him. His palm felt warm, familiar. But there was a distance I couldn't cross anymore. As I stared into the dark, I understood something painful and simple. These signs hadn't been hidden. I'd seen them. I'd felt them. I'd chosen comfort over questions because questions threaten the life you've built. The realization didn't break me, but it changed the way my silence sounded. It no longer felt patient. It felt expensive. The realization hit me slowly, like water creeping under a door. My silence, years of choosing peace over confrontation, patience over suspicion, wasn't innocent. It wasn't noble. It had become a currency, a way to keep others comfortable while I carried the cost. I had always believed that staying quiet, smoothing over tensions, and letting little oddities slide was part of being a wife, a daughter-in-law, a good person. Now, I understood it differently. My quiet had been bought with my own money, my own trust, and my own sense of self-respect. The next morning, I woke to an empty house. My husband had left for work, as usual, and the sunlight spilled across the kitchen table where yesterday's coffee cups sat untouched. I sank into the chair and stared at the small stack of bills I'd left there, picking up the credit card statement. I knew Linda had been using it, not as a favor, not as help, but as a tool to keep a secret going. Every transaction, every little charge wasn't just about groceries or clothing. It was about control, about hiding something from me while expecting me to stay oblivious. I flipped through the receipts again. Boutique items, coffee shop lunches, a massage appointment at a place I didn't know existed. Each line was a reminder that my silence had been purchased in installments, one small indulgence at a time. The more I studied the list, the more I realized how much I had been funding without knowing it. My generosity had been hijacked and my trust exploited. The realization made me ache, but it also stirred something harder. Anger. I remembered the weeks when I had ignored the small hints, rationalizing them as coincidences or harmless oversights. Like the time my husband came home with a new jacket that didn't belong to him. Or so he said. I didn't question it. I'd seen him leave the house in his usual clothes. Surely he'd bought it on the way home, or maybe a friend had gifted it. I had shrugged it off and let it go. And Linda's comments, those little compliments, those hints about other women, the way she spoke about my husband's thoughtfulness had seemed trivial at the time. I had laughed politely, nodded, and moved on. My silence had been my armor, my shield against awkwardness, against confrontation. But now I saw it for what it was, a way to pay for someone else's comfort while burying my own doubts. I went through the house that morning, noticing details I had ignored before. The spare bedroom, where my husband occasionally stayed overnight when he helped Linda with errands, smelled faintly of her perfume. I hadn't noticed it until now. And when I did, the sting of betrayal sank deeper. The small signs had been everywhere, but I had chosen not to see them, choosing instead to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Later that day, I ran errands, forcing myself into routine. At the dry cleaners, the clerk handed me a receipt for a package pickup. I glanced at it casually and froze. The recipient's name wasn't mine. My husband's? No, Linda's. I took it anyway, my fingers trembling as I held the envelope. It was nothing illegal, just clothes pressed neatly, waiting for someone to pick up. Yet it felt like evidence, proof that my silence had funded someone else's convenience, and not by accident. Driving home, I thought about the small acts of trust one had given over the years. Every time I let my husband handle a detail, every time I deferred to Linda's judgment, every time I ignored my intuition, I had been paying a price. Not in money alone, though that was part of it. I had been paying in quiet heartbreak, in the slow erosion of my sense of security, and in the subtle humiliation of realizing that others could act freely while I remained unaware. That evening, I tried to confront the feeling of betrayal gently. I asked my husband about his week, watching his expressions closely. There was a flicker, brief, almost invisible, before his face returned to normal. I caught it. Not a lie exactly, but something held back. I pressed a little, asking about errands he'd run. The answers were rehearsed, polite, almost too perfect. I smiled and nodded, knowing better than to push. My silence had always been more than an option. It had been a tool. And now I understood that I had given it freely, unknowingly. Later that night, I found myself standing in front of the kitchen window, staring out at the streetlights flickering across the neighborhood. My mind wandered to small details from weeks prior, the way Linda had needed help with a computer issue, the way my husband had volunteered to go over every time, the way I had dismissed it as kindness or routine. All of it now seemed orchestrated. My silence had allowed it, and my funds had enabled it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized the depth of the pattern. My own hands, the ones that had poured coffee, folded laundry, and picked up prescriptions, had indirectly facilitated this quiet deception. Each act of trust, each choice to avoid conflict, had added to the balance sheet of betrayal I hadn't noticed until the credit card call. The mundane tasks of daily life, the very routines I had clung to, had become the medium through which my patience was exploited. I began keeping a journal, writing down everything I remembered from the past months. Small purchases, odd comments, fleeting smells, subtle shifts in behavior. Each entry was a piece of evidence, a way to reconcile my confusion with reality. Reading back through it, I felt both fury and sorrow. Fury that I had been used, sorrow that I hadn't trusted my instincts sooner. The next day, I found myself at the boutique, listed on the receipts. I told myself it was to see what kind of purchases had been made. The store was bright, the mannequins dressed in the latest seasonal colors. I asked casually about recent sales. The clerk smiled, unaware of the deeper context. She described 2 women shopping together last week, one older, one younger, laughing, picking items carefully. The description matched nothing I wanted to believe, yet it confirmed suspicions I had refused to name. Back in the car, I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. I realized then that my silence had not only been exploited financially, but emotionally. I had been invisible in my own home, my presence expected, my reactions managed, my trust taken for granted. Every choice to remain quiet, every instance I chose comfort over confrontation, had compounded into a network of convenience for others at my expense. At home, I couldn't sleep. I paced the living room, listening to the ticking of the wall clock. Each second echoed in my head like a warning I had ignored for too long. I thought about the times I had accepted explanations without question, the times I had smiled at comments that didn't sit right, the times I had stayed quiet during small hints that seemed harmless. All of it now added up. My patience had a cost, and I was the one paying it. The next morning, I went to the mailbox and found a letter addressed to Linda. It was from a delivery service, confirming an order in her name. The handwriting on the package matched mine. My signature had been used for authorization. My breath caught. That small, mundane action of filling out forms had allowed someone else to continue living a narrative that excluded me. My silence and my habitual cooperation had created a space where deception could thrive unnoticed. I sat down at the kitchen table, the morning sun cutting through the blinds, falling across the receipts, the letters, and the credit card statement. I could no longer separate my financial contributions from the emotional manipulation I had endured. Every purchase had a story behind it. Every item bought with my money was a subtle reminder that I had been too polite, too patient, and too trusting. My silence had bought more than comfort. It had bought deception, it had bought complicity, and it had bought distance from the truth. In the evening, I confronted a reality I couldn't escape. The house felt quieter, emptier, heavier. Every ordinary sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the faint buzz of a car passing outside, seemed amplified against the silence I had maintained for so long. That silence, once protective and peaceful, now felt like a weight pressing against my chest, reminding me that I had unknowingly paid for it in money, in trust, and in emotional labor. I decided to trace the receipts once more, noting the patterns, the times, the locations, the pairs of names, the minor coincidences I had once ignored. The more I studied, the clearer the picture became. I realized how much my own reluctance to question had allowed others to move freely, almost openly, under my roof. My silence had been both shield and cage, protecting me from confrontation while enclosing me in ignorance. That night, I went to bed with a heavy heart, but a mind alert in a new way. For the first time, I recognized my own power within this web of deception. My patience, my habits, my decisions had been used against me, but they could also become the tools of reclaiming control. I understood that the act of noticing, of documenting, of reflecting was the beginning of breaking free from paying for someone else's comfort at the expense of my own peace. The following days, I found myself more attentive, more aware of small details I had let slide. A smell, a glance, a comment. Each became a signal, a reminder, a breadcrumb leading me to the truth I had avoided for years. My silence had been a currency, yes, but now I was counting it differently, understanding its cost, and preparing to spend it on myself for once. Every mundane interaction with my husband and my mother-in-law now carried weight. I heard the tone of voice, measured the timing of text messages, noted patterns I had once dismissed. I began to understand that my silence had been a quiet allowance for manipulation. But understanding it was not enough. Awareness had to turn into action. I had to reclaim the value I had unknowingly given away. And so, as I sat alone at the kitchen table one evening, sipping coffee that had long gone cold, I realized a hard truth. My patience, my quiet, my willingness to overlook small irregularities had allowed a network of deceit to grow undisturbed. My silence had been bought in both monetary and emotional terms. And now, finally, I knew that the first step to reclaiming it was to no longer allow it to be paid for by anyone but myself. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen blinds, cutting stripes across the table where the receipts, letters, and credit card statements lay like evidence of a life I hadn't fully recognized until now. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the sharp edges of reality pressing into me. The realization of what my silence had cost me had settled, but it also sparked something dangerous and liberating, a resolve that I could no longer defer to the comfort of others. Today I would act, and I would do it alone. I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hand steady this time, unlike the trembling mornings before. The aroma of roasted beans felt grounding, like a tether to the world I had neglected to protect for myself. I sat down and stared at the stack of papers. My eyes scanned every line, every charge, every note of a transaction, and I could see it clearly now. Every indulgence had been funded with my own money, my own trust, my own patience. It wasn't just about finance, it was about autonomy, or rather the lack of it. I had long given up the illusion that confrontation would yield clarity without cost. Years of marriage had taught me the cost of speaking too soon, of questioning too sharply. People get defensive. Arguments fester. But this was different. This wasn't about a casual disagreement or a fleeting misunderstanding. This was deliberate. My hands had unknowingly supported deception. My quiet had enabled it. And no longer. I reached for the credit card. Holding it in my hand like a fragile extension of authority, I had never truly exercised. The plastic felt heavier than it had in years. I had authorized it for my mother-in-law out of kindness, out of habit, but the kindness had been misinterpreted. It was no longer an instrument of help. It was a tool in a chain that kept secrets in motion, that kept lies comfortable. I realized the first step to reclaiming my sense of self was to remove that tool entirely. I considered calling my husband first. I imagined the protest, the pleading, the excuses that would spill over my carefully measured tone. But the truth was, I didn't need arguments to make this decision valid. I didn't need permission. I didn't owe anyone the comfort of delay. I had delayed long enough. The call to the credit card company was brief, deliberate. My voice was calm, deliberate, measured, the way one might speak in a courtroom, even though the only audience was a polite agent on the other end. I want to cancel this card. I said, all access, effective immediately. There was a pause. The agent asked a few procedural questions. I answered them without hesitation. My pulse thrummed in my ears, a steady beat of power and fear intertwined. I could feel it in my fingertips. The decision wasn't reckless. It was controlled. It was mine. After the call ended, I placed the card in the drawer, away from sight, away from reach. And then, for the first time in weeks, I exhaled deeply. The house felt different, quieter but charged, as if it, too, recognized the shift. The kitchen felt larger, more open, less burdened by the unspoken contracts that had been in place for years. I sat for a while, letting the stillness settle over me. And then, without planning it, I began to notice things I had ignored for months. The little boxes of chocolates my husband brought home for Linda, but never mentioned to me. The carefully curated coffee dates that always fell on my busiest days. The casual compliments Linda tossed at him when I was in the room, phrased as if I was part of the conversation, but really meant for someone else entirely. These small, almost invisible acts were no longer background noise. They were context, evidence, a tapestry of betrayal I hadn't allowed myself to see clearly. By mid-morning, my mind had shifted from reflection to calculation. I began jotting down details, noting times, dates, and patterns. My approach wasn't vindictive. It wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity. It was about understanding exactly what my silence had allowed, and what it would cost me if I continued to allow it. I realized that the act of documenting, of giving names to feelings and events, was a step toward reclaiming power. I decided to drive past the boutique, where several of the recent charges had originated. The store was as bright and inviting as ever, mannequins dressed in spring colors, windows gleaming in the sunlight. I parked a few blocks away, observing casually, as though I were a passerby. Inside, 2 women moved among the racks. I couldn't see faces clearly, but I imagined Linda and the younger woman laughing softly, picking out items that my money had unwittingly purchased. The thought twisted in my chest, and I clenched the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. Driving back home, I passed familiar streets and neighborhoods, noticing details I had long overlooked: the corner bakery where my husband occasionally stopped on errand days, the florist where small gifts appeared on Linda's doorstep, the grocery store aisles where the receipts matched purchases I hadn't made. Each sign, mundane in isolation, formed a map of my inadvertent complicity. I had been funding a lie piece by piece, day by day, without realizing the cumulative weight of my silence. Once home, I prepared a light lunch, but didn't eat it immediately. Instead, I sat at the table, staring at my reflection in the window. The woman looking back at me had changed in ways that were subtle but undeniable. There was a hardness around her eyes, a new certainty in her jawline. The soft, accommodating wife I had been was still there, but beneath her, a core of resolve had formed. I realized that this core born of betrayal and awareness, would guide my actions moving forward. Later in the afternoon, my husband returned. He stepped into the house, carrying a briefcase and a faint scent of his cologne mixed with something floral that was not his usual. I noticed it immediately. His smile was practiced, his tone casual. I nodded politely, aware of every inflection, every movement. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to ask. The decision I had made had already shifted the dynamic. We sat for dinner, and the conversation was perfunctory, mechanical. I listened, attentive, noting the subtle ways he avoided certain topics, the pauses, the phrases carefully chosen to avoid disclosure. I realized then that my silence had long been a safety net for him, a cushion against the consequences of his choices. But that cushion had been removed, quietly, without fanfare, without confrontation. The space it left was mine. As the evening wore on, I found myself alone in the living room, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. I reached for a notebook, jotting down thoughts, observations, and emotions as they came. Writing had become a method of grounding, a way to translate the chaotic swirl of feelings into something tangible, something I could manage. Each sentence I wrote was a reaffirmation of autonomy. My decision had real consequences, but it also gave me clarity I hadn't felt in years. That night, as I prepared for bed, I noticed my hands were no longer trembling. The decision to act alone, to reclaim control over my finances, and by extension, my emotional boundaries, had imbued me with a steadiness I hadn't known I possessed. I reflected on the small signs I had ignored, the compromises I had made, and the quiet costs of my silence. For the first time, I understood that action, calculated, deliberate action, could coexist with compassion, that reclaiming agency didn't require cruelty or shouting, only awareness and courage. I thought about the mornings ahead, the conversations that would come, the tension that would rise, the questions that might be asked. I wasn't afraid anymore. I had made my choice. It was mine alone, and with it came a sense of liberation that I hadn't anticipated. My decision wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about confrontation for the sake of drama. It was about reclaiming what had been silently taken from me, my sense of self, my trust in my own judgment, and the quiet authority over my own life. And so, as I drifted into sleep that night, I felt an unusual calm. The house felt different, still familiar, still home, but now it carried the subtle weight of accountability. No one could act with my resources without my awareness. No one could exploit my silence without consequence. My choice had shifted the balance. And though the journey ahead promised discomfort and difficult conversations, I faced it with a quiet, unwavering strength. The decision to act without asking anyone had not been easy. It had required confronting fears I had long suppressed, acknowledging emotions I had long ignored, and embracing the uncertainty of what my choice might trigger. But it was necessary. For the first time in years, I felt in control, and in that control, I discovered not anger, but clarity, not vengeance, but authority over my own life. By the end of the week, the subtle changes were already apparent. Phone calls came later than usual. Texts arrived with more caution. My husband's casual laughter felt slightly forced, as though he sensed a shift in the atmosphere. I didn't taunt or accuse. I simply existed in the reality that I had carved for myself, one decision at a time. Each moment reinforced the power of acting with intention, without seeking permission or validation from anyone who had previously benefited from my quiet compliance. And as I sat alone on the porch that evening, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog, I realized a profound truth. Sometimes the most significant choices are made not in confrontation, not in yelling or pleading, but in quiet, deliberate actions that reclaim the autonomy you had always had but were too polite or too afraid to exercise. My decision to act without asking anyone had cost me nothing and gained me everything I had silently been waiting for. The morning after my decision to cancel the card and reclaim control, the house felt different. Not empty, not sad, but lighter. The air seemed to hum with a quiet potential I hadn't noticed before, a soft, almost imperceptible vibration that reminded me I no longer carried the weight of everyone else's secrets. The constant hum of deception, the tension that had lingered invisibly for months, had thinned. I could breathe again without guilt pressing on my chest, and the silence was no longer oppressive. It was mine. I made myself breakfast, and for the first time in weeks, ate slowly. The toast was golden, the eggs perfectly cooked, and I noticed every flavor. Normally, meals were rushed. Normally, conversation was constant, a careful ballet of politeness. But now, no one demanded my attention beyond what I wanted to give. I realized that for so long, my life had been a constant negotiation of patience, of restraint, of pretending that I didn't notice small, uncomfortable truths. That negotiation was over. I stepped outside, into the backyard. The grass was still damp from last night's rain, and a faint, earthy smell rose with every step I took. I inhaled deeply, letting the cool morning air fill my lungs. There were no voices from inside the house calling me to hurry or explaining away someone else's choices. The only sound was the occasional bird and the distant hum of a car passing on the street. It was ordinary, yes, but ordinary had a new meaning now. Ordinary felt like freedom. I sat on the garden bench, the wood smooth beneath my fingers. I allowed myself to reflect, not with anger, not with revenge, not even with sadness, but with clarity. I began to see all the little ways my life had been manipulated by my silence. The purchases on the credit card, the errands I had assumed were innocent, the compliments my husband and mother-in-law had exchanged in my presence, they all painted a picture of quiet betrayal. But seeing it clearly, without emotion clouding the edges, gave me a sense of power. Knowledge was not pain, it was liberation. Later that day, my husband came home. I noticed immediately the shift in his demeanor, the casual confidence he had relied on, the one that came with knowing I would never confront, never challenge, never act without warning, was gone. His smile was polite, measured, slightly tentative. He said hello, kissed my cheek, and asked about my day. I answered honestly, but without offering more than necessary. The tension in his body language told me he sensed the change. I didn't need to say anything. The decision I had made, quietly and deliberately, spoke louder than words ever could. I spent the afternoon cleaning out my home office. Filing cabinets that had been ignored for months were sorted and organized. Receipts from years past, old bills, letters, notes, all of them cataloged and understood. As I handled each document, I realized that the act of reclaiming order in my environment was symbolic. Each organized drawer was a boundary I was reinforcing. Each piece of paper I could now read and understand without panic was a step toward reclaiming the space that had always belonged to me. By evening, I found myself in the living room with a book I had started months ago but never finished. I sank into the armchair, the one by the window where sunlight pooled in the late afternoon. I read for hours. For the first time in a long while, I was absorbed entirely in something that had nothing to do with other people's expectations, manipulations, or distractions. The characters on the page, the words I had chosen for myself, the escape of imagination. They reminded me that my mind and heart were still mine to nurture. The days that followed were subtle but powerful. I began noticing things I had been blind to: small acts of kindness from neighbors, the delicate turning of seasons outside my window, the way my cats stretched lazily in the sunlight. These moments, which I had once taken for granted, now felt vivid and grounding. The noise, the constant murmur of deceit, pretense, and indirect manipulation had stopped, and in its place, I discovered peace. I also noticed the emotional effects. The anxiety that had gnawed at me, the tiny panic attacks when the phone rang with unknown charges or texts that didn't make sense, they subsided. My sleep improved. I could sit in a chair for more than a few minutes without my mind racing through potential crises or explanations for behavior I didn't understand. My thoughts were my own, and that was a luxury I had long forgotten. One morning, I took a long walk through the neighborhood. I passed familiar houses, the corner store, the park where children played. I watched parents with their kids, couples walking their dogs, friends meeting for coffee. And I realized that I had been so preoccupied with guarding my life from the quiet betrayal of my household that I had almost missed the richness of ordinary life. The silence now allowed me to notice fully and freely the ordinary beauty of it all. I also began reconnecting with myself in ways I hadn't allowed before. I started writing daily, journaling the experiences, feelings, and insights that had previously been buried beneath stress and worry. I kept track of my emotions, my boundaries, my expectations. I reflected on choices I had made, both small and large, and recognized that the power to protect myself had always existed. I had just been too afraid, or too polite, to claim it. Then there was my relationship with my husband. It shifted gradually, subtly, like the turning of a tide. We spoke, we shared, but the dynamic had changed. He was more careful, more measured. He sensed, I realized that my awareness was no longer negotiable. I didn't need to accuse or yell. The consequences of his previous choices had already been set in motion. I had silently redefined my boundaries, and he had no choice but to respect them. I noticed my interactions with my mother-in-law also changing. There was less expectation, less assumption of my compliance. Her casual control, the small requests, the dependence on me to manage her errands, the subtle manipulations that had gone unnoticed began to diminish. She, too, recognized that the silent infrastructure she had relied upon was no longer in place. My decision had ripple effects I hadn't anticipated, and yet I felt no remorse. I was reclaiming space, fairness, and dignity that were always mine. By the end of the week, I began reintroducing routines that I had long neglected. I cooked meals for myself without rushing to serve someone else first. I listened to music I enjoyed, not what others preferred. I reconnected with friends I had drifted from, spending afternoons in conversation that fed me emotionally instead of draining me. The silence in my home became an ally. It was no longer a vacuum of dread or tension, but a buffer against the noise of manipulation. One evening, as I sipped tea on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I reflected on what I had gained. It wasn't revenge, though I had to admit there was a quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that my husband and mother-in-law could no longer act freely without my awareness. It wasn't confrontation. There were no dramatic declarations, no shouting, no explosions. It was something subtler, something far more powerful: clarity, autonomy, and peace. I had gained the ability to live in my own life without carrying the weight of deception, manipulation, or unspoken betrayals. I realized that my silence had been a form of payment, yes, but now that it was withdrawn, I had something far greater than I had ever imagined. I had self-respect. I had control. I had awareness. And with those, I could make choices that truly aligned with my needs and values. Each day became a practice in maintaining this balance, in appreciating the absence of chaos, in honoring the space I had reclaimed. The next morning, I woke early and brewed coffee as the sun rose. I walked slowly through the house, noticing details that had previously been invisible. The curtains I had washed last week, the small potted plant by the window, the family photos I had rearranged to reflect perspective rather than expectation. All these details felt like markers of a life I could now steward fully. I moved through the house with intention, without fear, without guilt. Later that day, I met a neighbor for lunch. We talked about trivial things, gardening, grandchildren, movies. Normally, these conversations would have been punctuated with tension, a subtle undercurrent of needing to report back, to keep appearances. Now, I spoke freely, laughed fully, and felt no weight on my shoulders. The noise, the constant hum of manipulation and expectation, had been replaced by the quiet joy of being myself. I even began to revisit some financial decisions I had long postponed. I reviewed bank accounts, planned small investments for my own comfort, and set boundaries that were both practical and emotional. The act of taking control over my finances became a metaphor for reclaiming my autonomy. Money was no longer a tool for someone else's comfort or deception. It was a resource for my peace, for my security, and for my future. One particularly quiet evening, I found myself reflecting on the irony of the situation. For years, I had assumed that silence was safe, that patience was protection, that compliance was love, and yet it had cost me dearly. Only when I took deliberate, assertive action did I realize the true value of my own voice, my own judgment, and my own attention. The silence I had maintained for so long had been expensive, but reclaiming it had been priceless. Over the following weeks, small things continued to signal change. My husband's habitual excuses for errands faded. My mother-in-law stopped calling as frequently, realizing her influence had waned. I noticed an unexpected calm in my daily routines. I could drink my coffee uninterrupted. I could sit in the living room and listen to music or read without a mental tally of who needed what next. The world was quieter, yes, but in that quiet, I discovered myself anew. Finally, one afternoon, I stood by the window watching the neighborhood kids play outside. I felt a profound sense of clarity. The experience, the betrayals, the small signs I had ignored, the money I had unknowingly contributed, the decision to act independently had transformed me. I had gained peace, agency, and a clear understanding of my own worth. The noise had stopped, and in its absence, I had space, clarity, and power. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't drama. It was the quiet reclamation of a life I had always deserved. And as I sipped my tea, listening to the soft evening breeze rustle through the trees, I knew that what I had gained was more than I could have imagined. A life lived on my own terms, free from silent manipulation, and full of the ordinary beauty I had once overlooked. Looking back now, I realize how much of my life had been spent negotiating quiet compromises, small sacrifices, and unspoken tolerances. For years, I believed silence was strength, that overlooking the oddities and the subtle betrayals around me was an act of patience, of love, of keeping the peace. But what I learned through this experience is that silence, when misused, can become a costly currency, a payment I had been making for the comfort, the convenience, and the hidden agendas of others. Each smile I offered without question, each errand I ran without hesitation, each time I laughed politely at remarks that pricked my gut, they weren't harmless acts of kindness. They were the foundation for a pattern I had allowed to take root, a pattern where my trust and generosity were quietly spent while I remained unaware. And yet, it wasn't anger or revenge that ultimately brought me clarity. It was awareness, the slow, deliberate process of noticing, of listening to myself, of reclaiming boundaries I hadn't realized I had surrendered. When I finally chose to act, when I canceled the card without asking anyone and set my own limits firmly in place, I discovered something I had long forgotten: my own power. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting or accusation, no vindictive declaration of truth. Instead, there was quiet, almost imperceptible authority, the kind that comes from understanding your worth, honoring your instincts, and refusing to let your patience be misused. And in that quiet, I began to notice the ordinary miracles that life had been offering all along: the warm sunlight through the blinds, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the laughter of children outside my window, the comforting aroma of fresh coffee in the morning. These simple things, once invisible behind layers of worry and tension, became vivid and grounding. I realized that the peace I had long craved wasn't in controlling others, and it wasn't in avoiding conflict. It was in reclaiming myself, in making deliberate choices that honored my own boundaries and my own worth. Over time, the subtle shifts became more apparent. Relationships adjusted. My husband's casual evasions became more measured. My mother-in-law's expectations began to fade, and the invisible tension that had hovered over my home dissipated like fog under morning sunlight. I could move through my days without holding my breath, without calculating the cost of silence, without fearing what small details I might have missed. The house felt lighter, the air cleaner, and most importantly, I felt lighter too. I was no longer paying unknowingly for someone else's comfort. And in that freedom, I discovered a strength that had been waiting for me all along: the power to act, the courage to assert my needs, and the calm clarity of living life on my own terms. Now, when I sit alone with my coffee, watching the neighborhood wake around me, I feel a quiet, deep contentment. I understand that life isn't always dramatic. It isn't always punctuated by loud confrontations or explosive revelations. Sometimes, the most profound victories come in the form of deliberate choices made quietly, firmly, and without seeking approval. My silence is no longer a cost. It is mine to spend or withhold as I choose. And in reclaiming it, I have found not only freedom but also a renewed respect for myself, a gift far greater than any material possession, a gift I can carry forward for the rest of my life.